All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Oh, hello. Everybody, welcome to Boswell Book Company's in-person and virtual event series. We are very honored to be hosting the latest nonfiction book from Deborah Cohen, Last Call at the Hotel Imperial, the reporters who took on World at War. The book has been receiving amazing reviews. I don't know if you know my little obsessions. There's a program called Bookmarks where they tabulate all the reviews and how they're going. And every review is a rave, which is the highest rating. So I just want to quote, if I may I may quote from one of them in the Wall Street Journal. Edward Costner writes, as they follow Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, Americans are getting an inkling of what it felt like 8 decades ago when fascist dictators were on the brink of plunging Europe into war. Today, the war news is available around the clock on TV screens, in print, and on the internet. Back then, the best source of news was an intrepid band of young American newspaper correspondents whose exclusive dispatches brought home word of the coming cataclysm. These journalists had been chronicled before, but Ms. Cohen, a history professor at Northwestern University, takes their story to a new level with prodigious research and sparkling prose. This book is a model of its kind. I started crying. I don't even know how you felt from that. Deborah Cohen is the author of The War Came Home, Household Gods, and Family Secrets. She is also the Peter B. Ritzma Professor of Humanities and Professor of History at Northwestern University, focusing on modern Europe. And we are so honored today to have a very special conversation partner. Louis Friedland is the Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor Emeritus in Journalism at Mass Communications at UW-Madison, founder for the Center of Communication Democracy, and the co-author of 5 books, and also a very good friend of Boswell, as he used to live in Shorewood, I believe. Used to live in Boswell. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you both. Enjoy the program.
Thank you all so much for coming today, and what a treat it's a treat for me to be asked to read this book. I was so honored when Deborah and Daniel asked me, and so let's just get right to it. I have to echo, it's a lovely book. It's a marvelous book. I read many books for a living, or at least I did until recently, and I still do. This is just one of those books that brings a story to life that you've never heard before about people that you should know about. And especially me as a journalism professor, I should have known all of these people, and I did not know them. And afterward, I felt like I had lived with them. So it's a marvelous book. I can't recommend it highly enough, but let's move past that. Deborah, thank you for writing it. Can you introduce us to the, can we call them dramatis personae?
Absolutely. So before I got started doing that, I just wanted to thank Daniel Golden for issuing the invitation, to Boswell's for hosting us, and to my conversation partner, Lou Friedland, who is one of the country's most important scholars of the media landscape and the relationship between civil society and media, and a Wisconsin treasure. And his new book, Battleground, I recommend to you all. Okay, the personae. Let's say that you walk into this Hotel Imperial, and there's a group of young American reporters who are gathered there. I'm just going to kind of bring them to life a little bit for you. The first person you would probably see is a tall, handsome, blonde Chicagoan named John Gunther. He has made his name with a book called Inside Europe, published in 1936, a behind-the-scenes, taboo-breaking account of the dictators that are wrecking the European continent. So he's tall, and he's affable, and he's very much the sort of person who other people like to tell him all their secrets. As a friend of his says, you just put your head right down on the cushion of his personality and start talking. The person who's most likely to be arguing with him is a thin wire of a man, H.R. Knickerbocker, who's shot out of Yoakum, Texas. He becomes, by reputation, the most highly paid foreign correspondent in the world. He was working for Hearst's International News Service. And among other things, he's the bête noire of Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, whom he takes on in a number of showdowns, but one in 1939 that is splashed across the pages of the world press. At the center of this group is a woman reporter, a woman journalist and commentator, Dorothy Thompson. She has a square face. She is known as someone who can hold her liquor. She has interviewed everyone from Freud to Trotsky to Hitler himself. She is one of the most lucid and smartest commentators on European affairs and also on American affairs. She goes on to amass a string of firsts, including she's the first woman to run, American woman to run a major overseas news bureau. She's also the first reporter to be kicked out of Nazi Germany, first American correspondent to be kicked out of Nazi Germany. And then there's Dorothy Thompson's longtime friend, the journalist Vincent Sheehan. So all of this group of people, they're all friends. You have to imagine them sitting around a table arguing with each other. Vincent Sheehan publishes a book in 1935 that really creates a kind of template for a lot of other people, millions of other people's personal experiences, a book called Personal History. And Sheehan's correspondence, Sheehan's papers are in part actually at the Wisconsin Historical Society, which is where I did some of my research. And then there's one more person, not a reporter, no, not a full-time reporter, a part-time correspondent, Frances Feynman Gunther, who's married to John Gunther. And she's the kind of person who you meet her in a bar and she really doesn't want to be there. First of all, she doesn't like bars. But whereas the whole rest of the group are boisterous, trading stories, trafficking in rumors, Frances Gunther is the kind of person you have to lean in to hear her, and then she might bite your head off. She becomes one of the fiercest anti-British Empire campaigners in the United States. And she's in a very strange little Venn diagram of people who are both adamant Indian nationalists and also adamant Zionists by the 1940s. That's a very small number of people, the left and the right spectrum. So.
Thank you. That was a wonderful. I was afraid you were going to leave out Frances for a second, who's so central to this story. She weaves through everyone's life. So let's first of all, where's the Hotel Imperial?
The Hotel Imperial is on the Ringstrasse in Vienna. It is the place. People describe it as having an aroma of conspiracy. So it's still there, but it's the kind of place where you go and you see there all kind of sorts of people are gathered there. They're the turpentine brokers and the diamond merchants, and then the tipsters who are coming by to peddle some tips for a buck to the American reporters who are gathered there.
I have to say quickly, are any Alan First fans in the room? Well, if you love Alan First, you should buy this book. So let's go back to where this started. This strange group came together from some very different places. None of them were highborn, I think it's fair to say, but all of them were incredibly ambitious. So how would you tell the story of how they came to be?
So they are young people. So there's all of them are born around the turn of the 20th century. So they grow up with the 20th century. So they're in their 20s and the 20s and their 30s and the 30s and so on. As Lou said, they don't come from the Ivy League. They come from the Midwestern heartlands or small towns in Texas, like H.R. Knickerbocker. So Jimmy Sheehan is born in and grows up in Pana, Illinois, a coal town in the south of the state, close to where Lou also grew up, population 7,500.
One county over, yeah.
They come together because they find themselves, and you have the book, you'll see there are maps of the ways in which their travels crisscross in the frontispiece. And they come together because they are all part of a very small number of American reporters who were sent out by American papers in the early 20s to actually record the news for an American audience. The idea is that it's time for Americans to report for Americans. And what they're doing is they sort of fan out and then they begin to cross paths with each other. So they meet each other in putsch. They meet each other when there's a bank failure. They meet each other when there's an assassination. And then slowly, they become really fast friends. They're rivals, they're lovers, they are very good friends.
The story of their, well, first of all, this whole book could have been written about their various affairs. I think I'm sorry. There's so much interweaving of the personal and the journalistic and the political in this book. And in fact, they see the book that way. Gunther and Sheehan both went to the University of Chicago, which, if you know where Pana, Illinois is, the fact that Jimmy Sheehan got from sitting in an apple tree reading Dickens and Austen in Pana to the University of Chicago is itself a small miracle. Gunther, working class German family with an extremely literate mother who read constantly, and of course Knickerbocker from Texas. So they come together in the 20s, and they are kind of a lost generation in formation, although later Sheehan scorns that term. But can you talk about how their sort of bohemian life before while they were becoming journalists, I suppose we could say?
Yeah, so they're all people who are kind of fed up with the United States, more or less. So they are, someone like Sheehan is, you can imagine, he's quite a strange character there in Pana, sitting up in the apple tree reading his books. And so they have a strong attachment, all of them, to European culture in various ways, or to, they're really interested in Asia, in the Middle East. They're restless sorts of people. And so they set out trying to figure out what is going to be the big story. So Jimmy Sheehan, H.R. Knickerbocker, John Gunther are all cub reporters. So they're used to, in the United States, they're used to covering gangsters and shootouts and Rotary Club luncheons and corrupt politicians. And they managed to get themselves to sort of working on cattle boats, tricking editors, persuading people to send them abroad, quitting their jobs and just deciding that they're going to be stringers. They managed to get themselves over to Europe. Frances Gunther and Dorothy Thompson, as women, have a slightly different trajectory. They do PR work in the United States, and then they just decide, they call themselves journalists, and then they set out for, in Frances Feynman's case, she sets out for the Soviet Union in 1924, just arriving by train to Leningrad. And in Dorothy Thompson's case, she sets sail with a couple $100 in her pocketbook across the Atlantic and then starts to get work as a stringer. But they're all making bets, right? One of the things that you had to be as a young reporter, and still true today, is you had to have a good sense of where's the next story going to be. So they're all making bets. So Frances thinks the big story is going to be the Soviet Union and the kind of consolidation of communist rule. So she goes to the Soviet Union. John Gunther and H.R. Knickerbocker come to think that maybe the big story is the rise of fascism. And they're incredibly prescient early on. They very quickly realize that this is the big story, the rise of the dictators. Sheehan is really interested in anti-colonial movements, so people who are rebelling against imperialism in all of its forms. So he goes and in trekking by mule in incredibly difficult romantic circumstances to find the Rifi leader in northern Morocco, Abdul Krim, and he manages to interview this guy 2 times, which is, a journalistic coup, but all tied into his sense about the evils of imperialism. And And Dorothy Thompson is really interested in what she thinks might be the big story of the post-war years, which is the fact that European monarchies may well come back to power. And so she's tracking that story. It seems far-fetched now, right? But at that time, it seemed possible. Who knows? Maybe Karl of Habsburg is going to be able to reclaim his Hungarian throne.
And Dorothy's in Vienna during much of this time, although she started in Berlin, if I'm not mistaken. In Vienna, so there is this, there's so many stories, there's stories upon stories upon stories, and I want to actually talk about all of them. But Dorothy's in Vienna, and various actors converge on Vienna at a time when there's a kind of rolling coup going on. There's an Austrian Nazi party. There's Vienna itself is known as Red Vienna because it's a bastion of socialism. And then there's the Heimwehr, which is the homegrown, essentially fascist party of Austria. Can you just describe that? And
absolutely. I mean, in some ways, Austrian politics is not so unfamiliar to us because it's a terribly politically polarized system. So, as Lewis said, Vienna, which is the big city in what is left of the Habsburg Empire, right? The Habsburg Empire disbanded, falls apart at the end of the First World War. And then Austria, the Republic of Austria, a democratic republic, is left. And the question is, can this place even survive? It doesn't really have any industry to speak of. It doesn't, the Habsburg Empire, essentially, Vienna is like London without an empire, is the way in which people describe it, which is it even a viable country? And so they end up converging there because as today, East Central Europe, right, is the place where you can, that's the kind of tinderbox in a lot of ways. And so they spend a lot of time in Vienna and then in parts east. So Austria in particular, they bear witness to, I'm just going to take 1 year, the year 1934, to both a civil war that is actually happening on the streets of Vienna, and then also to the assassination of the Austrian dictator, Dollfuss, who, as Lou has said, it's a confusing situation, but essentially what it is that Dollfuss has his own brand of fascism, which is different from Nazism. And so what he's trying to do is distinguish between the two of them. He is afraid that Hitler, as Hitler said on the first page of Mein Kampf, is going to annex Austria. And Dollfuss is fighting for Austrian independence, representing his Austro-fascist party. And then I won't say so much about what happens, but interspersed in this chapter about 1934 is John Gunther's psychoanalysis. He goes to psychoanalysis, begins his psychoanalysis in January of 1934. In February, there's a civil war. In July, there's the assassination of Dollfuss. And his analysis is playing out against the backdrop of these major political events.
You talked about Francis going to Moscow, and I want to talk about the relationship of Francis and Jimmy to the Soviet Union. First of all, who did she meet when she was there?
So Frances, as she was then Feynman, meets everyone who is anyone in the constructivist art world and in theater. So for instance, she knows Eisenman. She's always urging John when he goes to meet all sorts of famous Russian theatrical scene builders and directors. She meets all these people. She's the kind of person who just decides she's going to meet someone and she just rushes in and does it. And she really will not take no for an answer. So she looks very frail and very retiring, but is in fact someone who makes her will known.
Among them, Isadora Duncan.
Isadora Duncan, indeed. She meets Isadora Duncan, right. She interviews her.
Who quips when they meet a Russian, I believe, countess. That's the kind of person who should be shot or something to that effect. So interesting conversation that you wouldn't expect from a great dancer necessarily. Jimmy's also in the Soviet Union around this time, a little bit later. And what is his experience there?
So these are politically engaged people and becoming, they're not, Frances is when she leaves the United States, but Jimmy is sort of a person with a lively social life and a lively artistic life, but he becomes someone who's really politically engaged when he goes to, first of all, to China, which is in the middle of the struggle between nationalists and communists. And then when he goes to Moscow, he's completely taken up by the question that he feels is the most urgent question that every person should ask themselves, which is, what is the relationship between my one life and the world around me? So this is a question, obviously, that in a way is very familiar to us now, right? What difference do events, 3,000, 5,000, 6,000 miles, 8,000 miles, what difference should they make to the kind of cast that your life takes? But that's really Jimmy's question. So as he says, he has too much of a fondness for the finer things of life, a good whiskey, a nice silk and linen white suit, to actually become a Bolshevik. But his sympathies are all on the left, but his tastes are all on the right. So.
Yeah, I forget if it was overlapping. Well, he meets Raina Prohm there, and that's a fascinating story in itself. But was he with Eddie Sackville West yet during?
Oh, yes. So Sheehan is the one who's born in Pana and goes to the University of Chicago, and he's tremendously. He's one of these characters who's brilliant. He reminds everyone of a character right out of a Fitzgerald novel. And you feel his charm. To read his correspondence is just to be bowled away by him. I mean, anyone who reads his correspondence would just be drawn into the ways in which he sees his life. So Sheehan is immensely attractive to men, to women, to everyone. He goes to London, and he's really from Pana to the famous Bloomsbury circle of writers and artists and aesthetes. And Eddie Sackville West, who is at that point the heir to the largest house in Britain, so this is Vita Sackville West's cousin, falls completely in love with him. And then they have a relationship. And then Jimmy basically dumps Eddie Sackville West and then takes up with the painter, the Bloomsbury painter, Duncan Grant. So he's that sort of a person. He's unbelievably charismatic, incredibly smart.
And he has this, I don't know, how would you describe their relationship? It's, when I was reading it, I would have said platonic or non-sexual, but it was non-sexual with Raina Prohm, this woman who he has the most intense relationship with in Russia. Can you describe that just a little bit?
Yeah, so one of the kind of guiding moments for Sheehan's life, his question is, how do you square your individual life with the life of the collective around you? And the collective for him is really represented by this young, fiery Illinoisan Bolshevik named Raina Prohm, who goes to China to organize for the Communist Party, and then she goes to Moscow. And Jimmy, he describes it as, this was not a sexual relationship, but this was the most profound and transformative relationship of my life. And you'll see in the book that she's writing letters to a partner, trying to explain what Jimmy is and what it's like to deal with him. Anyway, he's one of these people who no one who ever met him forgot him, right? Just a hugely charismatic, hugely seductive person.
So I just want to touch, I know there's so many things I want to touch on, but Nick is not too long after Knickerbocker is also in Moscow. And it's important to remember that he was the international correspondent for the Hearst papers, which were at that time becoming increasingly conservative, even perhaps reactionary. But Nick goes to the Soviet Union and describes it very differently. Right.
So Knickerbocker he packs himself, 100 tons of food or 100 cans of sardines. I can't remember what the amount is, but he takes the suitcases full of sardines and he gets on a train and he goes to explore the Soviet Union. And he's, as Lou says, he's working for the International News Service, and he is really appalled by what he finds in the Soviet Union. So he's someone who's really interesting because he does not for a second underestimate either the scale of the transformation that is happening or the brutality of it. So you have many people who go to the Soviet Union and say, well, it's all just a bunch of plans. Knickerbocker goes to Magnitogorsk, the big foundry, the sort of Gary, Indiana that's being built in the Soviet Union, and says they are basically creating a breakneck industrialization that is going to make this an industrial powerhouse. At the same time, he's also one of the first American reporters to report and to relay information about the famine in Ukraine. So the young Welshman, Gareth Jones, who comes back and files these reports about what he sees when he gets off of a train and starts tramping through Ukrainian villages, Knickerbocker sends those reports home. So Gareth Jones has a big press conference, and Knickerbocker then writes articles about these reports. And he has no trouble believing that the Soviet state is a brutal state, that it will starve millions of its people without any kind of remorse. And this is a position that eventually a romantic like Sheehan also comes to.
Right, he comes around, but a long way around. Knickerbocker's also not involved with Mussolini, but he's interviewing Mussolini during this time. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, this is so.
Not long after, I should say.
So one of the things that they do is that they get interviews with the major figures of their day. So Mussolini, Hitler, Gandhi, Nehru, on and on and on, and a ton of Churchill, FDR, Trotsky, exactly. Thank you. And Knickerbocker is one of the most astute people on the Nazi party. He has been warning from the early 20s. When he walks into that beer hall, he's been warning about the rise of the Nazis. He, as I said, is also really perceptive about what the Stalin's first 5-year plan is and what Stalinism is. And yet he goes to meet Mussolini and he says, well, he's very well informed. Mussolini, that is, he is a great charmer. He's not like those kind of Prussian types who you meet if you deal with the Nazis, like a Goebbels type. And maybe a character, maybe this is what Italy actually needs. So the larger point that I would want to make here is that they were still trying to figure out what modern dictatorship actually was. And that was not self-evident. So what people were trying to understand is, so what was this new kind of rule, and would it eventually moderate? Maybe the dictators, Mussolini and Hitler, would destroy each other. They're trying to understand what this new form of rule is. And so someone like Knickerbocker actually just gets Mussolini wrong. He doesn't understand his expansionism until he actually reports from the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, today Ethiopia.
Yeah, that's an incredible story as well. There's, again, so many. Knickerbocker, I just want to note, wrote a series of articles, 24 articles from that experience in the Ukraine and on the famine and the Soviet Union, which won him the Pulitzer in 1931. And let's talk about Hitler for just a few moments, since you brought up Goebbels. John Gunther, in the 30s, was making a tour of Eastern European dictators. He was becoming a specialist in European dictators, almost, one might say, a connoisseur of Eastern European dictators of various varieties. We want to hear about that, and then his relationship to to Hitler. And then I want to talk about Dorothy's a little bit too.
So this is back to, so John Gunther very early on, because he's reporting from East Central Europe. So he's traveling all the time. He travels half of the year as a young man. So he's traveling to Austria and Turkey and Greece and Romania and Bulgaria and on and on and on. Germany, of course. He writes to his a girl he wants to impress, actually another Wisconsin connection, Emily Hahn, who does her degree at
UW-Madison College of Engineering.
Madison in the engineering school.
And by the way, that the faculty of the College of Engineering, UW, my lifelong home, petitioned to have her thrown out of the college to the state legislature, which refused, although today they might have done it. Who knows? Sorry.
Yeah, no, so Emily Hahn becomes a New Yorker journalist reporting from China. She's a sort of an outer circle person in my book, but John Gunther is deeply in love with her and he's trying to impress her. So he's running around all of these East Central European countries and he writes her a letter where he says, I think that the real story of today is not the story of democracies. That's the story that people think is the story that comes out of the Paris Peace Conference, which is all the democracies that are going to be founded. Instead, he says, I think the real story is the rise of the dictators. Hey ho, what kind of a story is that? And that he proceeds to write that story, and that really becomes the story that makes his name. And it was to focus on the dictators was also to do something that, again, is very familiar to us right now, which is to try to understand the personalities of these people. Who are these men whose personal quirks, whose upbringings, whose psychological profile, whose aggression? Who are these men who are affecting the world, whose decisions are going to change the fate of the world? And that becomes his story.
That blending of the personal and the political as a style of journalism, which those of my generation might think of as the new journalism coming much, much later on in the 70s, really was pioneered here. Dorothy Thompson was maybe among the leading practitioners in a variety of ways. Can you talk about her, first of all, her experience in Germany, her prescience and warning about Hitler and her experience there?
Yeah, so Dorothy Thompson is another good example. So she famously in 1931, she manages to get an interview with Hitler and misjudges him or misjudges his possibilities. She says, the headline is, I saw Hitler. And she says, I thought I was going to be a really impressive, ferocious person. But within a few minutes, I realized this is an utter insignificance. And how could such a man rule Germany? And of course, all of her friends then tease her mercilessly about this later on. And she redeems herself by becoming one of the most ferocious campaigners, crusaders against Nazism. And, avid, ardent, Cassandras for the need to actually, for the United States to join in the European struggle for democracy. But the fact that someone like Dorothy Thompson could actually get it wrong shows us just how inchoate and confusing the situation was. And also, I think tells us something about today too, which is that right now we're so laser focused on Putin and Zelensky, actually, because in a way they're what we can see, especially Putin, who stands in for Russian public opinion. But it takes many decades to understand actually what is going on in places where you have no sense of what public opinion actually is, right? That's the work of historians. The journalist's work at that moment is to try to understand what can be seen. And in this case, in their case, it was Hitler, Mussolini, et cetera, the leaders. And in our case, obviously Putin.
Dorothy got thrown out of Nazi Germany, redeemed herself by being, is it the first correspondent, I think?
First American correspondent.
First American correspondent. I was shocked when I read this book and I'm embarrassed to say it even in front of all of you and the internet, that I didn't know who Dorothy Thompson was. But in fact, she was in terms of her influence and her fame by the late 30s and 40s, parallel to Walter Lippmann, no?
Right. So Dorothy Thompson had one of the first that she had was that she was the first woman political columnist in the United States. She had a thrice weekly column, syndicated, alternating with Walter Lippmann's, and an audience of an estimated 8 to 10 million, just to give you a sense of her immense importance and influence. And so I think one of the things that is a mystery is why is it that these people fell out of kind of our consciousness? You know, why do we know, for instance, Janet Flanner, but we don't know Dorothy Thompson? And I should add that Dorothy Thompson has been the subject of a few biographies, but the very, very best of them, really an extraordinary book, is American Cassandra by Peter Kruth, which, if you're interested in Dorothy Thompson, is a wonderful place to start. And the question is, so what happens with Dorothy Thompson? And I think one part of this explanation is that she's both very analytical, but she develops a very emotional style that by the end of the Second World War in the early 50s is no longer something that people any longer want to read. I mean, I think the 1930s, like now, is a highly publicly emotional style. So Dorothy Thompson is always talking about, you know, the future of civilization and mothers and children. And you can see from our world right now how immensely persuasive that is and how it draws you in. It was the crack is made about Dorothy Thompson that she's the first woman to have her menopause in public and to make it pay. And she cultivates that style, as does Jimmy Sheehan as well. It's a highly emotional style. And then after the Second World War, when people think, oh, all that emotion, all that sort of misdirected emotion, at least, that the style of international relations becomes realism. It becomes a kind of sober, buttoned up style. And I think Dorothy Thompson just seems, you know, anachronistic.
Can you quickly tell the German-American Bund story?
Oh, yes. This is just a brilliant story. So Dorothy Thompson as I said, she becomes an advocate for American intervention in Europe. You know, whether that's sending arms to the Spanish Civil War Republican fighters, or whether that's eventually entering the European war. And so for that, she's a loathed person by anti-interventionists. So she decides, and she's a provocateuse. She's someone who likes, she's not only writing the story, but she's also becoming the story. And she goes to a meeting of the German-American Bund, which is basically the fascist organization of America, happening in Madison Square Garden. And she's dressed very carefully for the occasion, although she says that she's actually just stopping in on her way to give another lecture. But she has these amazing satin sleeves in a black velvet dress and white satin sleeves. And she goes into this meeting in Madison Square Garden, 20,000 Nazis, American Nazis, and, you know, all the signs all over it. And they start talking, and she starts heckling and yelling. And she says, bunk, this is all bunk. This is just Mein Kampf, word for word. And then is, of course, surrounded by brown shirts and also police who are trying to get her out of there before, you know, she's knocked around and beaten up. And she resists. She says, I'm absolutely going to come in. And she's hooting and laughing. And then, of course, the next day, it was a very effective strategy, because the next day, the papers are full of not stories about the Bund meeting, but instead stories about Dorothy Thompson. So taking them down a peg or two by laughing at them.
And she became an advisor to FDR.
She was, by lore, she's writing some of the famous fireside speeches, although politically she was very suspicious of the New Deal. She didn't like any kind of state overreach.
But it was so interesting that she was a supporter of FDR, a strong anti-fascist, anti-Nazi, and also a critic of the New Deal at the same time. We can't end without talking about psychoanalysis, which is a major, not just a thread, but a stream that runs through the book. from personal life to, and I'm paraphrasing you, a kind of psychoanalysis of world politics. And that really is, these were people who were constantly, they were in psychoanalysis, they were psychoanalyzing each other. And as you put it, at the time there were little blue booklets. One was called "How to Psychoanalyze Your Neighbors." So this
That would be handy, right?
So this was a everyday preoccupation. You say something about their culture of psychoanalysis, the culture of psychoanalysis more generally, and then how it was connected to their analysis of world politics.
Absolutely. I mean, so this is a common sense psychoanalysis in America in the 1920s and 30s, in the sense that this is really, it's not just in the kind of Tower Town or Greenwich Village, but lots of Americans are really interested in psychoanalytic ideas. And so in that sense, the figures who are at the heart of Last Call are not so different, but where they are different is that they're super exposed themselves as reporters to world events, and they feel themselves continually drawn into the action and trying to understand what it actually means for them. So both they are, seeking, John Gunther seeks out Hitler's relatives in a little backwater town in Austria in order to try to understand what made Hitler the man that he became. And as much as they're trying to understand these, outsized figures who are ruling people's lives, they're also themselves registering the dissolution of the boundaries between private life and geopolitics. And that becomes something that they feel very acutely. And I think journalists today feel very acutely as well, which is you're almost metabolizing the crisis in your own inner life. I mean, a number of us, people have that idea, but I think journalists are particularly exposed to it. And so they begin to ask themselves and each other questions like, well, is intimate life, is a marriage geopolitics writ small? What kinds of lessons should we deduce from what we're seeing about child rearing? How should we raise our children differently? They're asking questions like, how is a marriage like an empire? And how is an empire like a marriage? Or what difference does one person make to the fate of the world? So those are questions that fundamentally are breaking down what they understand as the boundaries between inner life and geopolitics that certainly existed for their parents.
And as you've noted, the front page of the New York Times this morning has a treatment of Putin that's essentially precisely in this vein. So we're back there again. Before we stop, and I know we want to have some time for questions, but you end the book, and I guess we'll end this conversation before question time with "Death Be Not Proud," the book that John Gunther wrote about his son and his and Francis's son, Johnny. Can you just say a little bit about that?
I'm curious to know, thank you. Yeah. How many of you in the audience have read this book? We're assigned it? Yeah. And assigned it in school. Yeah. So one of the arguments I'm making in the book, one of the points I want to make is that this group of journalists are responsible for a lot of what we think about as the taboo breaking modern memoir, which is a result not of the 60s or of the 90s, right? We oftentimes think about something like Joan Didion's work as being, the taboo breaking memoir about death. In fact, John Gunther's Death Be Not Proud, which is about the death of his son, Johnny, from a brain tumor at age 17. This book, Death Be Not Proud, published in 1949, it becomes required reading in American schools, many American school systems from the late 50s onward. And one of the points that I want to make in the book, at the very end of the book, is that this practice that they engage in, which is about trying to understand the relationship between inner life and how people act on the public stage, leads them to feel, why do we have all of these taboos? Why shouldn't we be able to talk about sex and death? I mean, the two, Eros and Thanatos, right? The two big Freudian preoccupations. Why shouldn't we be able to talk about them? So John Gunther writes this book that is so shocking that his publisher, for whom he has made them millions of dollars, thinks we cannot publish this book. We cannot publish this book. It is too private, too personal, too awful. Who wants to read this? And then that's published in 1949 and of course becomes a sensation, really. And then the first of a group of books of very frank memoirs. And then Jimmy Sheehan writes a book about the marriage of Dorothy Thompson and Sinclair Lewis, her second husband, the Nobel Prize laureate, called Dorothy in Red, which is at the time viewed as the frankest memoir of a marriage ever published. And it goes into everything: Dorothy Thompson's lesbian affairs, Sinclair Lewis's alcoholism. So they are the people who are breaking down these strictures on what you can talk about private life. And they do that because of their experiences in the 1930s and in an attempt to sort of save the individual and save not just the individual, but also the full range of individual experiences, even the things that are thought to be too shameful and too private to write about.
Well, I have hours of questions left, but I know you have some too. So let's open up the floor. So the question is, Hitler was elected in 1932, 33, sorry. And why?
So, you know, this is a question that German historians have discussed and debated, historians of Germany, really since that moment, but also since after the Second World War. And as you say, economic collapse, especially the hyperinflation of 1923 that destroyed the value of money, but even the sense of what money was. Of course, the Depression itself, Germany had unemployment rates of more than a quarter of adult males unemployed. So that's up to 30 and 32% in some regions. So we're talking about complete economic devastation. And then, of course, there was the failed war, the defeat itself, and the legends around the defeat of the First World War, which was, you know, why had the German army lost? Had it been stabbed in the back? You can imagine, by the way, similar conversations happening right now in the Russian Federation about the failures of the army. One of the things that Carl Jung, who Knickerbocker interviews in 1938, he goes to Geneva and sits down with Carl Jung to talk about sort of why has all of this happened? And what Jung says is that Hitler, what a really good leader does is he's led by the people. And that what Hitler was able to channel was precisely that sense of defeat and revenge and the sense of, you know, needing to be made whole that the Nazi party promised. So it, you know, in place of a divided politics of the Weimar Republic where left and right are having street brawls, what the Nazi party and what Hitler promised is we're going to make you whole again. We have identified the enemies. We will kick them out of the body politic, and then you will feel whole.
And I would be remiss if I didn't note that the idea of the Dolchschluss, or being stabbed in the back, comes from Goebbels and the lying press as well, a trope that I think we've also heard somewhere in recent years. So this comes straight from Goebbels and the Nazi Party. Others? Has the book been optioned for a movie? And if not, are there any bidders in the audience?
It hasn't yet, and I think that, and perhaps this is ambitious on my part, but actually what it is it's a limited series because there's so many storylines. And in part because of their writing is so vivid. And so someone like John Gunther tells you what the street smells like after an evening of German bombing, after an evening of the Blitz. So he walks down streets and he smells the perfume because the perfume bottles have all broken. And that's what the street smells like. And so you can't convey that in visually, but that they have an extraordinarily visual sense, and that's what they provide you. They see things and they record them. And part of the reason why they were very, very famous journalists is because they really are terrific writers. So I hope that one thing that the book does is cause people to go back to their work, to, Inside Europe, Inside USA, Death Be Not Proud of John Gunther's, and Personal History of Vincent Sheehan's, of Jimmy Sheehan's. So that being said,
be repeated in the world we live in today, given the speed of media and our instant gratification?
It's a really good question, because the obituary for the foreign correspondent has been written again and again and again, especially in the last 30 years. And certainly the number of foreign correspondents is many, many fewer. The number of media outlets, television, radio, newspapers who actually have foreign correspondents is much smaller. And part of the reason is budget cutbacks, but the other part of the reason is that if every person in Mariupol has a camera, why do you need to send a photojournalist? And I think we need both things. So the day after my book was published, there was a Times story about a new media venture, as of yet untitled, by two, kind of well-known entrepreneurs and people who have been really successful in the media business. And what it's going to be is, it was headlined with the era of the foreign correspondent is over. And one of those founders says it's insane to send a young Ivy League graduate off to Mumbai in 2022 to report on what's going on in Mumbai, which actually sounds like a kind of logical position, right? Why not just hire local, let's say you want English-speaking news, you hire local English-speaking reporters to tell you what's going on there. But I think that doesn't take into account one of the crucial things that really fantastic foreign correspondents do, which is they have a comparative imagination and comparative experiences. And it's precisely because they can see the world as a whole that they're able to tell us things like, very early on, any foreign correspondent, anyone who'd been in Grozny, or anyone who'd been in Syria, said what the Russian forces will do the second they encounter a staunch defense is they'll just bomb the cities to rubble, because they had been there. And there are many instances like this in Last Call, where someone like John Gunther is taking Dictators seriously because he's traveling to all these places. He has both a bird's eye view and also comparative imagination. And that you can't get just by hiring, 1,000 local reporters, because what it means is all the analysis is being done by someone sitting in an armchair at home. And that's not good enough, I think. Fundamentally, we demand comparison, an outsider's perspective, and those sorts of things. When of our anthropologists or our political scientists or our historians. And it's sort of like, really, we don't want that from our reporters as well?
We now have a bit of a cue. Daniel, Chris, do we end at 5 precisely? The question is about the Spanish Civil War and why we don't hear as much about it as we ought to, and what place it holds in the book.
I completely agree with you. And one of the interesting things for me in writing the book was in resuscitating this contemporary perspective. So it's an immersive book. It's supposed to put you there as you're learning what they're learning. And so something like Austria in 1934, people at the time thought that was a turning point. And then, of course, it gets enveloped and swallowed up by all the other turning points that come, or the Italian invasion of Abyssinia in 1935, or the Spanish Civil War. And so the Spanish Civil War does play an important part in my book, because it's one of those moments when reporters are now starting to take bets. When is World War? The World War has already happened. It's already come. The Spanish Civil War is the World War. So they're taking bets on, are you, as Knickerbocker says, are you an end of 1936er, or are you in late 1938er, and when you think the Second World War is going to break out? And for Knickerbocker himself, it's the Spanish Civil War. That's where the battle between, in a way, a three-cornered battle between fascism, communism, and democracy is playing out. So for people who lived through that, that is completely foundational. As to why it's sort of, it fades here. I mean, there's a institutional reason, which is there are so few historians of Spain. There's so few academic departments, university departments that actually have Spanish historians, which is a great, great, great shame. And it's partly because of the dictators, the long-lived Franco dictatorship. The archives weren't open for a very long time. But then it's also, there was always a lot of money to do German history and a little bit of money to do Italian history and not enough to do Spanish history. I know I want to become a Spanish historian. So my next act. What prompted me is that I went to look at the correspondence about Death Be Not Proud, because I was interested in that book. And John Gunther got thousands and thousands of letters from parents. And so I thought, that's interesting. I live in Chicago, and it's rare as a European historian that I could ever use a local archive. So I thought, I'll go down. And then I started to read in the miscellaneous correspondence in the Gunther papers, which are voluminous. I mean, huge, 250 boxes, big boxes. And in the miscellaneous correspondence was a letter from Nehru, from Jawaharlal Nehru, about his wife's death. And I thought, Nehru is in the miscellaneous correspondence. This is the first prime minister of an independent India. And if he's in the miscellaneous correspondence, who's in the named correspondence was actually written out. And so I started there, and I was just, I mean, my visual image for myself, and part of the accounting of the last 8 years, is that I felt myself like in a vortex. I was like swept into that archive and into those papers and completely transfixed by them. And then a project that began with Gunther, then of course expanded, first of all to his marriage, and then to his friends, and then beyond that. And it's, I mean, they're a group of people who jump off the page at you. I had worked in private, archives, in personal papers and state papers, but I had never encountered anything like that. So that's why I wrote it.
I'm going to exercise privilege and ask you to end with the story of Jimmy Sheehan going to Gandhi.
Jimmy Sheehan believed that he actually had a kind of sixth sense for trouble, that he was a kind of lightning rod for the university's ills. And you can see that this is the connection between inner life and geopolitics that I was talking about before. So he begins to feel Gandhi is going to be assassinated. I know it. And he's looking, he has a lighted globe, and he spends his evenings late at night, probably drinking too much, looking at that lighted globe and thinking about where the trouble is going to break out next. And he has a presentiment that Gandhi will be assassinated, and by a Hindu, and he travels to India because he thinks, maybe I can stop it. I should be there. The reporters need to be on the spot to predict what's going to happen next. And he is literally there in the courtyard as the assassin fires his bullets. And of course, is devastated because he feels, if I knew it was going to happen, why couldn't I have stopped it? So in that image, I think, is encapsulated both the sense of presentiment and foreboding that you have to have in order to be a really good reporter, but also something for us that's pretty tragic to think about, which is the sense of responsibility, of the burden of bearing witness.
What a wonderful way to end. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And thank you, Deborah.
Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And thanks to those people who have been watching at home. So thanks to you all.